To all our friends in Switzerland. It's Robert Giffra. I have the privilege of being chair of the American Swiss Foundation. And this is probably one of our most popular webinars every 4 years. This is our webinar on the 2024 presidential and congressional elections in the United States. We have two really, really great speakers with us today. We have Meredith McGraw, who is a young national political correspondent for Politico. She was a young leader in 2022. She's also been a White House correspondent. She's also been a reporter for ABC News, and she was originally from West Virginia. And it's my privilege to introduce Chris Ruddy. Chris is the CEO of Newsmax. He was a young leader in 2001. Chris founded Newsmax in 1998. And Newsmax is considered one of the top 12 U.S. news brands. And I think, right after Fox, I'd say it's probably the most important news brand on the conservative side of the ledger. I mean, he's sort of like he's a younger version of Rupert Murdoch, I like to tell people. But it really incredibly successful and has really built one of the really most important brands. So why don't we get right to it? This was obviously a very consequential election. Donald Trump won in the Electoral College 312 to 226. He won all of the swing states. He won the popular vote, which I believe was only the second time for a Republican since 1988, the other being the second term of George W. Bush. The Senate is now going to be 53-47, and the latest House count, which I saw, was 218 to 212 for the Republicans. Donald Trump is the first American president since Grover Cleveland to be reelected to non-consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland was president in 1885 to 1889, and then from 1893 to 1897. Why don't I start off with sort of my first question to our panelists? With all of the legal issues that Donald Trump faced, do you think that this is the greatest comeback in American political history, surpassing, I think most people used to say, Richard Nixon winning in 1968 after losing the presidency in 1960 and losing for governor in 1962 and saying you won't have Nixon to kick around? Is this the greatest comeback in American history? Meredith?
I mean, it is quite the comeback indeed. I think before we even start this conversation, I kept thinking back to where we were at just 4 years ago. After Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, his approval rating had dropped to just 29% after January 6th. In the 2022 midterms, which he was heavily involved with endorsements and fundraising, the Republican Party had blamed him for a lot of the losses there and really had anointed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to be the Republican successor. And even after 34 felony convictions and launching a third bid for the presidency, he wiped out his primary contenders pretty decisively early on. And so I think when you're thinking about this win in particular, it's good to just keep in mind everything that transpired over the past 4 years and all of the moments where I think it was completely reasonable to believe that Donald Trump would not be in this political position that he's in right now, where he is once again heading back to the White House.
Chris, why do you think President Trump won so decisively?
Well, I'll mention on the follow-up to Meredith there that the comeback issue, the president called me at about 3:15 in the morning. I think I was the first phone call after he gave his victory speech in the West Palm Beach Convention Center. The reason was because Newsmax had been the first to project him the winner earlier that night. I think we beat Fox by about 45 minutes. And I said to him, Bob, I said, this is, Mr. President, this is not the biggest comeback in U.S. history, as J.D. Vance had just said on the stage. I think it's the biggest comeback in the history of the world. And he laughed and he said, why do you say comeback? This is not a comeback. I said, it's not a comeback. He said, no, I never left. And in his mind, he had never left, and comeback suggests that maybe you had failed along the way. But I think what Meredith said was the legal stuff that he had gone through such a barrage of legal attacks, 34 felonies and all of these different cases. And then for him to emerge the winner, despite all of that, just seems so incredible. And then answering your question about the decisive victory, looking at the exit poll data as I did, it shows that 7% of voters decided the last week who they were going to choose. If you back out, I think there was about 155 million voters. If you back out the 7% and you see that they went for Trump about 60-40, it comes out to a 3 million vote plurality, which is exactly what pretty much he had in the popular vote. And before that, voters were undecided or slightly maybe in favor of Harris. So that last week was very decisive. And usually you have a situation like that, they break for the incumbent person in power. They've known Trump for a long, long time. They still hadn't made up their mind about him. The suggestion was they were probably not going to go for him at the end, but they did. I can't tell you the exact reason. I think Kamala Harris was a very poor candidate, and her inability to articulate her message and her vision was devastating. I think Trump had what I call the McDonald's moment. When he went to McDonald's, donned the uniform, he was so much in his element. As you know, Bob, I've known him for 25 years. The guy loves McDonald's. So he actually was really quite at home there. He's been eating McDonald's, I'm not sure every day, but you could say arguably like almost every day for 40
I
years.
believe he actually does eat McDonald's because he does.
Oh my God. Yeah. I always joke, he started at like Trump Tower in 1980, and I always said his diet consisted for the first 20 years of a Big Mac, fries, and Coke every day for lunch. Big Mac, fries, and a Coke. And in 1997, 98, they tell me it had a radical change. It became a Big Mac, fries, and a Diet Coke. And I think at the White House, he didn't eat McDonald's that much. I remember once discussing with him that he was deprived in the White House because he had no White Castle hamburgers nearby. And those of us in New York know White Castle has a very sort of special fast food hamburger. So the guy definitely likes hamburgers.
One of the things he did, I thought, in the last week of the campaign was really sort of going back to the Reagan question of 1980. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And my recollection of 1980 was that the undecided vote broke strongly for Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter. Meredith, do you think this was a campaign that was ultimately decided based on the economy?
I think the economy was top of mind across the board. The economy, immigration too, but inflation historically is just that's a tough to run against. You mentioned Jimmy Carter. I think one of Harris's issues was voters want to vote for change. They want a change candidate. And Harris really struggled to explain how she would be different from President Biden. She was given a lot of opportunities by the press when, asked how she would be different, where she couldn't really clearly articulate that. So I think that was one issue. And then, frankly, the Harris campaign, the Biden administration really could not reach voters and explain to them why they thought the economy was improving. And in the end, when Harris was talking about how Donald Trump was a threat to democracy, which for some voters, I think was a strong argument. For a lot of people who are just struggling to put food on the table, trying to figure out where their childcare was going to come from, it struck them as tone deaf. And, I was traveling across the country talking to voters, and a consistent thing that just came up was exactly what the question Trump was posing, and continued to do so at the end of the campaign is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And, it's kind of funny when you think back to 4 years ago, we had the COVID pandemic. It, was a dark time that I think a lot of people would like to forget about and sort of have. But they do remember their wallets feeling a little fatter. And so a lot of these undecided voters, but also just these low propensity voters that the Trump campaign was really targeting. The economy was really the number one issue.
One of the things that I think really probably helped President Trump was the fact, and this is where running in non-consecutive, running again helped him. I think people kind of remember the pre-pandemic economy, which was a very strong economy. So when people said, well, you can't trust him to be president again, they remembered the economy before. So he had the benefit of being a change candidate, but he was also someone who had been president before. So it's sort of like, make America great again and go back to the way things were was kind of a very powerful message. It appeared toward the end. Do you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people like you remember that Harris and a couple of these others and some of the media, MSNBC, started accusing him of being Hitler and Nazi. It didn't really work because they knew him for 4 years and saw that he had not been really hit. He had not been Hitler, a little authoritarian at times, that he wanted to push through the border thing and stuff like that. He used executive power expansively, but to suggest that he was a Hitler or Nazi was just so beyond. So it didn't work. And I think that they did have very fond recollections but of the economy, and certainly they hadn't been hit by inflation, which effectively wiped out the net worth, really hit middle class and lower class. If you look at Trump's numbers, they're fantastic for anyone that made less than $100,000, and he did pretty well for people under 50. She did better over 100. Though people most hit by that 25% cumulative inflation were the ones that voted for Trump. And not that necessarily he had a plan to fix it, but they were angry with her. And she didn't, as Meredith said, they never really explained how we got into that situation and how they were going to get out of it.
When you think about consequential American political figures, it's those who really transformed the political system. FDR, Reagan. And, when you think about what the Republican Party was pre-Donald Trump, it was sort of seen as a rich person's party. It really wasn't a working class party. I mean, Meredith has sort of, when you think about the people who voted for Donald Trump, those were people who probably, going back in their families had been, FDR Democrats and probably New Deal Democrats and then Great Society Democrats and union workers. These were people who would have voted against, Mitt Romney or George H.W. Bush, yet they voted for Donald Trump. Is he a transformative figure in American politics by realigning the parties, actually turning the Democrats into a coastal sort of elite party, and then the Republicans into sort of a more of a working class party, which I don't think I ever would have expected, 10 or 20 years ago.
Well, I think there were two ways I've sort of looked at the results of this election. And one is what you're touching on here. And that is the dramatic shift we saw in voters to the right who have traditionally been loyal to Democrats. We're talking about union households, wage workers, Black and Latino voters, in particular, Black and Latino men. The Latino male vote, dramatically shifted towards Donald Trump in this election. And then also the youth vote, too. We saw how young men shifted towards Donald Trump, men under the age of 45, and female voters, too. There was a shift towards Donald Trump from what we saw in the 2020 election. And, I think part of that was the campaign strategy of the Trump team. They were really trying to reach out to constituencies that just had been out of reach for Republicans for a while. You think about them, spending money to reach out to Arab voters in Michigan, or really trying to court union and labor voters as well. And then, the youth vote, that was such a big part of the Trump campaign's media strategy that, at the time when I was covering it, I thought they're trying to reach young male voters who aren't very likely to come out and vote. And that seemed really risky. We all know young guys in their 20s, and I wouldn't maybe put them as the most reliable people to lean on.
Like Joe Rogan.
Yeah, and the Trump campaign, they went on all top four Spotify podcasts. Theo Vaughn, they went on Tucker Carlson show, but Joe Rogan's, who is incredibly influential with young male voters. And there were two advantages that I think Trump had with using this as a kind of media strategy. I think one, there's a lot of people that are just disaffected when it comes to mainstream media. A lot of young people these days are getting their news sources from social media, from TikTok, from Instagram, from podcasts like Joe Rogan's. And it also allowed Trump to spend a lot more time with these voters. You think about these podcasts and they go on for maybe like 2 hours. And so Trump is like sitting there talking to them about things that go beyond policy, but really tap into sort of like celebrity and pop culture, which is something that I think was a big part of his rise in 2016, was really leaning into that. And it's something that his team tapped into this time around, but really rooted in all of it. It sort of goes back to what we were just talking about earlier. It's just the frustrations that a lot of these people had about the economy, how their concerns about the economy were being viewed, and also about immigration too. I think, when you're looking at some of the trends we saw with Latino male voters, it was a lot of concerns about obviously the economy, but immigration too.
I think, Bob, I would just add to what Meredith says that if you look at the data, it was young males that moved very decisively. The youth vote had gone for Biden like 2-1 over Trump in 20. And in this election, it did go for Harris, but only by a couple of percentage points. So clearly all of those podcasts worked, the Joe Rogan effect. But the biggest shift that I saw, you could argue, is a cultural one, not so much an economic one. I think voters said they were very unhappy across the board about inflation, but Hispanics, Trump won that vote 46%. Bush had the record at 44. So Trump has gotten the most Hispanic votes in history based on those exit polls, which is amazing considering. And then the Catholic vote had gone for Biden. It went 58% for Trump. Now, Trump's campaign made a very significant effort against the woke DEI. They made a real effort pointing out they would take out ads in football games about that Kamala Harris wanted to pay for trans people to get trans surgeries at government costs. And I think the trans agenda was like a bridge too far for a lot of people. And the Democrats' efforts there, and you just saw across the board, Meredith mentioned Arab voters. Arab voters tend to be very conservative. They tend to be religious. Harris pulled in about the same amount of Black voters. I think Trump might have gone up 1 point, so it really didn't make a big difference there. And Jewish voters seemed to stick with Harris, which is a little surprising considering Biden's tug of war with Israel. But I think it was very much cultural impact and the economy together made Trump win decisively.
The interesting thing, I live in New York City and New York State. In New York State, actually, Trump really narrowed the margin from 2020 to the point where I think he only lost by 10 points. But the county that had the biggest gain for Donald Trump was the Bronx, which is the poorest county in New York State, one of the poorest counties in the country. And it's just a remarkable turnaround. Now, let's say a word about the Democrats. I mean, is the most unpopular person in the Democratic Party Joe Biden now, because he basically, at the age of 82, thought that he could, become president again? And would they have done better had they actually had a real, primary process, and as opposed to the coronation of Kamala Harris, who was sort of untested and hadn't been through the primary process? Meredith?
I mean, there is a lot of frustration within the Democratic Party about President Biden's decision to stay in. And, a lot of coulda, woulda, shouldas, a lot of what ifs. What if they had had an open primary? I mean, it raises the question of, would Kamala Harris have been put in the position that she is in now? She lost the primary, the Democratic Party primary, excuse me. She had not been seen as a strong candidate before she was tapped for vice president, and then she was put in this position now. I think it's, a combination of frustration towards Biden, and then, the Democratic Party is going to really have to rethink their messaging and how they talk to voters. What Chris was just talking about, some of the anti-woke politics, it was a bridge too far for a lot of people, and they felt like it was being, shoved down their throats by corporate America, and beyond, and just became too much. And this election was certainly, I think, a backlash to some of that. And I think at the same time, there really does seem to be a leadership void at the moment within the Democratic Party that I think over the next few months, we'll see start to shake out.
Now, one of the other things that happened in this election, and mentioned at the outset, was the Republicans won the Senate and they won the House. Do the Republicans now, Chris, have a mandate for change, and what change do you expect to occur over, say, the next 2 years?
I think they have a pretty clear-cut mandate that the country is culturally conservative and wants to stay there and doesn't want to do a lot of social engineering. So that's there. And I think they have a mandate on the border. The public wants that closed. I'm not sure the public's in favor of mass deportations. And I think that's going to get very thorny for the administration as they try to implement that. And I don't see it actually being fully implemented at the end of the day. It might be very selective at the end of the day. There's a lot of, for example, criminal people that came out of jails in Venezuela and elsewhere that were literally dumped across the border. And so I think there'll be an effort to remove them, and that would be positive. But
closing the border down, which hasn't really, I think the pictures of people just walking across the border, I know our Swiss friends could sort of relate to this. You can't just walk into Switzerland, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
A little bit crazy you can't really have a country when people can just walk in, and then obviously the pictures of people being flown all around the country, and they took over the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City, and New York State was spending literally billions of dollars housing people in a country where we have our own infrastructure and other issues that need to be addressed, and people were obviously asking, this doesn't make any sense. It kind of defies common sense. Meredith, those pictures really hurt Kamala Harris?
They definitely did. It's hard to argue with the images and the videos. Just even anecdotally, people who felt like whether it was real or perceived in some cases, that their own resources were being taken away to provide for people who didn't come here legally. So that was definitely a sore spot, and something that was totally botched by the Biden administration, top to bottom. But I do think Chris is right. I think when it comes to mass deportations that have been talked about, I think it's hard to imagine how that's going to be done. You think of the legal pitfalls that could potentially come from that, whether it's civil rights issues or, whatever, or just even the economic ramifications of a lot of that too. The different labor sources that some of these people provide. You think about farms and different things. So I think there's going to be a lot of, discussion about how that is actually, how they're actually able to deal with these millions of people that are here.
Chris, we've talked a lot about domestic issues. To what extent do you think that foreign affairs played an important role in this election? We've got war in Ukraine, we've got war in the Middle East, and I think Donald Trump, was able to make the case that he's a president who can basically get things done in terms of foreign policy, and some of the things that happened under Biden's watch, I think he argued would not have happened under his watch. What can we expect, and what can our Switch friends expect from a Trump foreign policy going forward?
Well, I think I don't think it was decisive in the election, although the exit polls showed that Americans thought that Donald Trump was better on foreign policy by a fairly good number over Kamala Harris. They also said that about his handling of the economy. So across the board. But voters, I don't think Americans feel the pain of the Ukraine war. They don't feel the pain of the Mideast war. I see the world as somewhat on fire. We have a major war in Europe. We have potentially a major regional war in Iran, with Iran and Israel, but certainly there are real hostilities underway and real attacks and counterattacks. I think we can lay a lot of the blame, I believe, with Biden. I think he's shown weak leadership, and Trump brought that home and mentioned it as one of his talking points. I think generally people agree that Trump is pretty strong as a world leader. And now he says he can correct some of these problems in 24 hours. Well, God bless him if he can. But if he does it in 4 weeks, it'll still be good. If he does it in 4 months, it'll be an achievement. So look, I think he's already, I remember having a conversation with him shortly after he was shot. He was at the Republican convention. We spoke on the phone. And he said, his biggest thing that he thinks he can handle easily, more than anything else, but his priority is ending that war in Ukraine, because he thinks that needlessly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are dying, and that it doesn't have to happen. I hope he's right on his ability to do it, but I think generally people around the world, and I do travel and talk to other people in foreign countries, they do seem to, even if they don't like Trump, they respect him. And he's somewhat, of a tough guy, and they fear him, and the fear principle seems to work abroad. So I can't in the crystal ball say he's going to solve all the world's problems, but I do think he'll bring some leadership and vision, and I think it'll be generally good for the world and Europe.
Meredith, what do you see as the big issues that the U.S. will be addressing over the next, say, 3 to 6 months under the start of the Trump administration? I mean, obviously, there's a honeymoon period. Then he's going to have the problem of being, facing, not being able to run again in 4 years in 28. So they've got to obviously come out of the box fast to get something done. What do you expect to be the big issues over the next 3 to 6 months in American politics?
Yeah, well, the first 100 days of any administration are so critical. And, most presidents spend them undoing the work of their predecessor. You'd mentioned Grover Cleveland before. Trump's the first president since then who's going to be reinstating, I think, a lot of his former policies. I've been talking to his team. We're in the thick of transition reporting now. I've been running around like crazy trying to figure out who's going to be going into the cabinet and who Trump is trying to tap for different positions. Even this morning was, furiously dialing up sources to hear what's next on some of these big picks. But a big part of it is going to be, on day one, they're going to have a slew of executive orders that Trump is going to be enacting that his team has already pinpointed which Biden administration policies they would like to undo and which ones they've prioritized for Trump to get out the door in terms of executive orders just on the first day. A big push, of course, too, is going to be trying to get some of these folks that Trump has tapped for cabinet positions confirmed. It's a Republican Senate, but he's also made a few controversial picks that I think are going to be causing some headaches up on the Hill for who they're going to get through. And then, I think Trump's been pretty clear about what his priorities are going to be right out of the gate. He's talked about tariffs. We still haven't heard who he's going to be tapping for some key spots like USTR and Treasury, but that could give some hints about the direction he might go in, even though he has been pretty aggressive about wanting to implement tariffs and really use that right off the bat. Immigration, executive orders related to the border, related to some of these deportations, executive orders related to some of the green policies that Biden implemented. It's the funding the government. It's going to be another big issue. And then I think one of the biggest fights on the Hill, of course, is going to be the Tax Cuts Act that is expires and is going to have to be reconfigured in 2025. So that's going to be a major fight on the Hill, and I think that's going to suck a lot of attention away from the White House too. So it'll be a pretty full agenda. It's, they have control of the Senate, but at the same time, as we all know, Republicans in the House and Senate are not always in lockstep. And so Trump is going to have to be working with that too.
Oh, I guess you got two senators, Murkowski and Susan Collins, who I think probably will be key votes going forward. Chris, what do you expect to see over the next 3 to 6 months of the second Trump administration?
Well, I think he's going to be very aggressive because he knows he has the House for 2 years. Usually the party in power loses the House in the midterm. That could be different this time if the president does, I think, some of his populist agenda items and the economy is good. It might remain in control of the House, but they only have I think it's a 7-vote margin right now, and it may change. So I think he tries to push through all the key things that he would like to do on economic issues, like the tax cut Meredith mentioned is going to be a big battle. And remember, he dropped the corporate tax to 21 from 35, and he said in his campaign he wants to lower it 15. I personally thought the 21% was too low for a number of reasons, and he got rid of the SALT tax, the state and local deductions from big states like New York and California. Damaged those states, and actually it was the main reason he lost the House. The Republicans lost the House in the 2018 election, and I think he says he want to bring that back, but you're going to have to find funding for it because a lot of members of the Republican caucus, the Club for Growth type guys, will do a tax cut, but they want it paid for somewhere. They don't want it to add to the deficit. So we're in a strange situation because remember, as a result of COVID, Pelosi and the Democrats locked in a 50% increase in the federal budget in 21, 22. We've had a 50%, it's over 6 or 7 trillion, close to $7 trillion now. And they didn't have an offset for revenues. The revenues came in only maybe about 10%. So that's why the deficit's been close to $1.5 to $2 trillion a year. And so now President Trump's coming in, he has this ambitious program, lowering taxes and this and that. But the deficit at some point has to be addressed. And so I think there's some really powerful economic headwinds that he's going to face as he tries to implement some of this.
Why don't I ask each of you one more one more question and we'll be done. Meredith, so bottom line, what's your thoughts on what we've seen in the election? Is this a game-changing election for America?
It certainly is a major shift in American politics. I've been covering Donald Trump since he was in the White House, and then I continued to cover him after he left the White House. And so I feel like just as a journalist or reporter, I've seen the full arc of Trump's political story at this point. And I do think the shift in particular that we've seen in the Republican Party over the past few years, the shift in political priorities and, how that was affirmed by people in this election, I think it's going to have a lasting effect.
And Chris, does Donald Trump have the ability now to be a historic figure like an FDR or a Reagan in light of this victory?
I think he's already historic in that he's the first man to be president that was never a politician or general, never elected to office. And I think he was pretty transformative. His first, there's a famous presidential historian from Carnegie Mellon, and he said that he was the most impactful one-term president. So now he's back for a second term, and I think he's got a lot of ambitions. I think he has the ability to be this great giant. But, let's see. Sometimes he does go into the street as a street brawl. He comes from Queens, New York, and he likes to go and brawl with people. And that's usually not indicative of somebody like a Washington, Lincoln, or Reagan, or FDR. So I think that he has the opportunity. I think some of his cabinet picks suggest really good choices. Some are not so strong and could be problematic.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. We really appreciate you taking your time to be with us. I know Faith Whittlesey is probably watching, smiling, because I'm sure you were two of her favorite young leaders. And well, Meredith might have come a little bit later, but we really
Yes.
try. We really like to have sort of good balanced conversation. And so thank you both so much. This has been really great. And thanks to all our viewers, and look forward to seeing you all again
Yeah.
in the future.
Thank
Bye.
you, Bob. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you,
Bye.
Meredith.
Thanks, Meredith.